Hello and welcome to Your Average Bear Gaming. I'm George. Today we're going to break into our Kill Team Octarius box set and we're going to start working on some terrain. So actually it's going to be a weird one because we're not actually starting on the terrain, we're correcting poorly done terrain that I did and I hated it. Why? Well, look at that. It looks really pretty gross, and I hated it. The longer I worked on this, the worse I felt about it, and it all kind of, well, look, there was just too much happening, there was too much going on, too many colors, too many details, and it made me feel gross, and so I decided I'm going to start over. I'm just going to reprime the whole kit and caboodle, start from scratch, learn my lessons, and work with relatively few colors of paints. So that is the plan. Sometimes things don't work out, but you got to do what you got to do. So let's give this another shot. So I've got my parts primed once again, and I went with two colors of prime. I figured I've got two of each of these models, so let's do some learning. If it doesn't work out, we can always reprime again. And so I've got this stuff primed in flat black, and I've also got these primed in silver. This is a textured silver paint from Krylon. It's silver hammered, and I've tested this in the previous video. It does have a little bit of texture, but it's not really that much, so it's not that big a deal. Also, it may be that both of these were primed with that silver at one point, so it doesn't matter. I'm just using it as silver primer, and it works well that way. So obviously I'm going to do these in two different styles, and I'm going to, so this guy, I'm going to basically use rust colored wash and dark colored wash for different elements of this thing. For this one, I'm going to try to do some, instead of painting it silver, I'm going to dry brush it silver and then see what I can do to make it look good after that. I've never done this before, so I'm going to learn. But I'm going to start with the easy stuff first, and that is adding some of this stuff. It's Fuegian Orange. It's a wash from Citadel Color, and it does a really good job of simulating rust. And so I'm just going to pick out a few panels and rust them up with the emphasis being on being very selective. I want to do some of these, not all of them, and not even most of them. I'm going to be a bit more conservative with my approach here. So the trick is to find some panels that you want to rust up. And I took this from some pictures I saw online. They kind of did this. It was a very simple kind of approach, and I think that's going to work for me, particularly in light of my previous failure where I got, as my old thesis advisor back in grad school would have said, I got too cute. In other words, I tried too many things at the same time, and I ended up making a mess of things. It's a lesson I have to periodically relearn. And here's what that looks like on its first pass. My selection kind of was this idea of picking out if there's a layer of metal, pick one, either the top or the bottom layer, and make that the kind of the rusty color, with the idea that I'm going to go back and the other panels I'm going to make them dark. And I'll do the same approach here on the back side. And I often picked the rear layer for rust, but that isn't always the case. Mostly because I didn't come to that selection process until a little late. So I'm going to try to stick to this from now on. But if there's a layer of metal, anything that's behind, like underneath, then I will rust that one up. On this top part, picking out which of these panels is going to be rust colored is a little bit tougher than it is for the top part. So here's what I chose. It looks okay. It's got, obviously I've got more to go here, but I'm going to use, in order to basically cut down on some of my decisions that I have to make, I'm going to use this top part as my guide. For some reason I found it much easier to pick out. Here are the panels I'm going to rust up on the top side. On the bottom side, it's a little harder, so I'm just going to go with what did I do up here and mirror it in the bottom. So this panel here corresponds to this panel right there. So that's what I'm going to rust up, and I'm going to make my other rusty selections using the same kind of thing, same kind of decision process wherever possible. I'm a big fan of reducing the number of decisions that you have to make at any given step. Maybe this is just something that's it's my issue, but I find decisions to be not difficult, but I go back and forth on a lot of things. It happens when there's not a right or wrong answer. You kind of vacillate between two equally potentially correct answers, and there isn't a wrong or right, so you have to pick something. And so by having a priori decision rule, in other words, a decision rule that you've decided upon before the fact, before you're making this next decision, then subsequent decisions become a little easier. Again, it's probably just me, but just that I'd share. It's a little less clear back here. So another thing that I kind of want to point out is I really enjoy this Fuegian orange as a wash. It's a wonderful, wonderful wash for what I use it for, which is typically just to create rust effects on metal parts. Assuming, that rust isn't appropriate, to my paint job. It does a really good job with that. However, I don't like the idea that it's pretty pricey. It's a typical Games Workshop kind of an offering. So it's like $8-9 for a little pot like this. I'm used to Army Painter stuff, which is maybe not quite half the price, but close enough that it doesn't matter. And so, it's a bit more expensive. And I hate working out of this pot. It's just such a pain compared to just adding some stuff to my wet palette and bringing it over to my project. I've tried before, like pouring some out into my wet palette. That was a bad idea. I guess I could have some pipettes for that, but I don't know where to get 3 or 4 pipettes. I don't need 50 or 100, which is what I would end up having to get if I went on Amazon to buy some little pipettes. And by pipettes, I mean like this. I happen to have this one because I collect fountain pens, and so that's a tool that you use for fountain pens. Okay, so that's done. I'm going to set these aside to dry. This next step is going to be a bit of a slog, I'm afraid. It is all about laying down some washes. So for the silver one, I'm going to do a dark wash to bring the brightness way down. Unfortunately, I have run out, or almost run out, of my dark tone. This is what I usually use, and it's a very nice, thick, reliable wash. Sometimes it's too thick, and I can thin it down a little bit with some flow improver, and it does a good job. I can even dilute it a bit. It works really well. Unfortunately, I'm almost out, and I know that I don't have enough left to finish the rest of this project. And I ran out doing the previous incarnation of this because it used a ton of wash. So I went online, found a couple of recipes, and I mixed my own. Unfortunately, I haven't dialed it in just right, and well, for some reason, this guy is thicker than my pre-mixed. And so I think there's something else in the Army Painter recipe that isn't in any of the recipes that I found online for kind of homemade well, it's technically null oil, since I don't know that anyone actually makes homemade Army Painter washes. The point is that it's going to be quite a bit thinner. It's going to have less coverage. I think I got the darkness dialed in okay, but I'm not 100%. And I'm going to use this big brush because I'm going to need a lot of coverage. And I'm just going to spread it around anywhere that is not covered with rust. I was playing with leaving some without the dark wash, but I think it's going to look better if nothing is too shiny. And I'm using a big brush here. I normally wouldn't use something this big, but these parts are kind of ginormous, and it takes forever to do this with a normal brush. So I'm using my dry brushing brush to lay down big old swaths of this tone. And it is much faster now that I'm trying this out. It's much faster than my previous attempt. Yeah, so I've got the darkness. It actually might be a little too dark this time. So I've got the darkness dialed in pretty okay. I don't have the consistency that I like with my washes. I prefer them to be a little more gloopy so that it does a better job of getting into those recesses. But it's not bad. It's certainly much better than my previous attempt. So maybe I've learned something. And with terrain like this, I think it's going to be a good idea to try to dial in your own homemade washes, because these are so big, they're going to require so much wash that it's going to be kind of an expensive proposition to do this with actual purchased washes. It won't be so bad if you use something like Army Painter. There's like $4 a bottle, but if you use something like Null Oil, that's what, like $8, almost $9 for a container, for a little pot. This is going to get expensive really quick. You probably will go through a single pot washing all this. Now with the homemade stuff, you can use as much of it as you want. It's not very expensive. And so that's what that looks like right there. Now with washes, the proof really is in the drying. How does this dry? Let's find out. That's what that looks like. It's kind of gross. It did this weird spotting thing that I hadn't seen before, and that's what I get for using homemade wash. It's gross. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this strong tone. It's not the color that I want. I still don't have my dark tone, but I'm going to darken it up with a little bit of paint, and I hope that that will do the job that I needed to do. I have plenty of this stuff, so I have the opportunity to experiment a bit. I'll darken it up with a little bit of black paint. Right, my parts are nice and washed, as good as I could get them. They're still a little blotchy here and there. It's the best I can do, so we're just going to have to deal with it. On these parts that I've primed black, I'm going to try something that I've toyed with before, but I haven't actually done, and that is instead of painting something silver, like for the base coat, I'm going to actually dry brush something silver. So it'll be black with, I want to say, a fairly generous dry brush layer. But I think it's going to work the way I want, but I don't really know. So let's give it a shot. So alright, so that's what it looks like on first pass, which is fine, but I think I'm using the wrong brush. Because I want a bit more silver on there than a usual dry brush. So I'm going to pick my little cosmetics brush here, which admittedly I fight with a lot. This brush and I don't really get along, but I'm going to give it another shot. Here's your chance at redemption. I'm never able to get it dry enough, so it always leaves way more of the paint than I want, but that's kind of what I want here. So alright, and so that's what that looks like. So it's just a black primer with a silver dry brush, and you know, it looks a lot like I covered it in really dark gunmetal paint, and it feels extra shiny to me. I kind of like it. I don't know how I'm gonna go about adding what little color I am gonna add, so obviously I can't use the Fuegian orange here because I don't know that it'll show up. I don't know that it'll show up over the black. So I'm going to have to try something else to represent rust, but I think it's a pretty neat look. Yeah. I don't know how it'll look, you know, on the full model, but I'll give it a shot. Here's another benefit to this approach to applying a base coat. I mean, it's not really a base coat because I'm dry brushing, but this is a lot faster than applying a actual silver base coat over the black. Even if it's a glaze, holy cow, this, I think, A, looks better, and B, is a ton faster. Assuming you're comfortable with the dry brushing technique, which, you know, for me is hit or miss, if you can get comfortable with it, this is a great way of painting large pieces very quickly, assuming that you want them, you know, kind of at a low level of detail, because you're going to get a lot of sameness out of this approach. But for such a large model, I think sameness is going to keep you sane. Alright, time to add some rust to my black primed models. Obviously we're not going to use the Fuegian orange, but I'm going to try something that has worked for me in the past. It looks pretty good. This is fur brown, and I'm going to make a wash of it. Not a glaze, a wash. It's maybe a thicker wash, but it's a wash nonetheless. So what it means, it's thinned down pretty nicely. It's like a drop or two, or 3 or 4 drops of this, about an equal part of water, maybe a little bit more water, and a couple of drops of flow improver. Should give you a very nice thin brown wash. And it has, this fur brown has some of these red tones in it that the other browns just kind of don't have, and that red tone is what really sets it apart as a rust looking. So I'm going to match the pattern that I have here just for simplicity's sake, and I'm going to go right on there. And so because it's so thin, a lot of the underlying colors are going to show up, but it's going to have kind of a rusty color to it as well, which is exactly what I'm going for here. Yeah, that looks fairly rusty. Not quite sure what's going to happen with the silver that I dry brushed on here, but push comes to shove, I can always go back and give it another dry brush on top. Yeah, this is the same color wash that I used for the tires on the test model. I just a couple weeks ago did a video on one of the scatter terrain pieces out of the Octarius Kill Team box. I was kind of testing it out. Was looking to see, was testing some primers against each other, and one of the happy accidents to come out of that video was this wash. When I put it over black undercoats, it looks a lot like rust. So I was pretty happy with that. And I would not have discovered it if I hadn't just experimented a bit. So, I always got to be learning something. This is the spice of this hobby. It's how you get better. And because it's a nice thin wash, you can kind of play around with how much rust is on any given surface. So you can kind of see some of these things are more rusty than others, and when it dries up, it's going to look like it has gradients, which is what I'm looking for. So these black pieces are nice and rusted. I like the look of them. It took me a couple of coats. Some of them were really light. Like that, for example, is a pretty light coat, but I kind of do like the variability. So I think I'll keep it. Some of them are a little busier than others, and that's fine. So in this next step, it's time to add a few colors. And I'm going to stick with a very limited palette of colors. I'm going to stick with matte black. I'm going to add a couple of black pieces to this, not as much as I had before. I'm going to be very selective about it. I'm going to use red, and I'm going to use pure red. I want it very nice and bright. So the black and the red are going to be very bright. What other color should I use? What's an Orky color? How about this? How about I stick to black and red? And if it needs more color, I'll go back and add it. Yeah, I think that's a good plan. Alright, so I'm just going to find medium-sized plates of armor to make black. And I'm starting with the silver primed pieces. And so I'm just going to get some pretty dark black, and I didn't thin it very much because I want really good coverage, although I think this is a little too thick. I'm going to need to thin this down because it's not flowing well. So the parts of this model that I'm choosing to add black to, they're just going to be kind of larger parts. So the black is going to act like my major secondary color, but I will add the red as the accent color. So that's going to go on select pieces, but they're going to tend to be smaller pieces, and I'll show you what I mean in a sec. This is all in an attempt to keep the model looking simple, limit the color palette. because the ones that I've seen online, they seem to take this approach. I don't know if it's intentional or not, but they look pretty good. And my previous attempt was overly complicated and gross. So this is my way of learning something from good work that other people have already done before me. So there's the black. I made sure that in each kind of segment of this wall, I added at least one piece that was black. And I'm going to do the same thing with the red color. So with the red, I'll do things like this. I also made sure this was only thinned a little bit, just enough to get it to flow really nicely. Not enough to really dilute the pigments in there, because I want it to cover pretty good. Alright, that's the basic idea. Looks a little boring actually, but I'd take boring over ugly any day. Yeah. I'm going to apply the same kind of idea to all the other panels. Alright, so the layering is pretty much done. You'll notice that I was pretty selective with the colors. It's mostly the base. It looks a little on the bland side, but I'm kind of erring on the side of bland as opposed to clownish the way I began this project. So I think I'm gonna be fine with that. I think the only thing I want to do is I want to further accentuate the difference in color between the tank here and those straps that are holding it down. You notice here that because of the way I did my dry brushing, the straps look a lot more silvery than the tank itself, so you can see the difference there. And because of my lack of preparation on the dark wash, that isn't as pronounced here. So I got my shipment with 2 new dark tones in it, so I'm going to make some liberal use of that to further drive up that contrast. But really the next step, once I finish doing this little bit here, the next step is going to be to just pick out a few details. So there are some details. So for example, there's all these dials, for example, and there's all these kind of little machine bits, this light housing. These are all details that I think deserve to be picked out from the background. You could just leave them in there, and if you're really concerned with doing this quickly, then this is probably as far as you need to go in terms of picking out certain details. I still have a couple of treatments to do to the entire thing after this, but I think for my time, I think it's going to be worthwhile to pick out little details like that. There's this little light housing back here. I want to pick out that detail, some like battery things. So there's just a few things on here that I want to pick out. And so I'll spend the extra time picking those out. I will probably stick to that military green that I use for my Imperial Guard. It's it's this guy. It's the Goblin Green from Army Painter. It does a really good job of conveying Army green with relatively little trouble. So let me work on touching up this contrast here. So I've got a lot of these details done. You'll notice there's all these dials have the yellow. This light bulb here has a bit of yellow. It's a yellow wash so that it kind of blends in with the white undercoat to give us a glow effect. And so the last kind of detail that I have to worry about is there's a ton of wires on this model. So I was going to just leave them, but I'm going to give them a color. I don't know, just to pick them out. I debated just leaving them with no color, but I thought it would be a little too lazy. But I'm also thinking, well, is this too much color. I don't know. It's one of those debates that I keep having with myself when I reach into my kit for another color. But it's looking all right. I wanted to use a color different from other colors I was using. So this orange seems to be working all right. So yeah, I'm going to pick out all the wires that I can see with this orange. All right, here are the first batch of buildings from the Octarius Kill Team box. And they don't look too bad. I'm not, really super happy with them, but they could have been a lot worse. And you know what? I think I'll take it. Yeah. So I think the important thing here is that I learned a couple of things off of this project. So I'll talk about them here. I guess the first thing is that you don't have to magnetize these. I thought I was going to have to do that, and it turns out I don't. These do come apart and they stick back together pretty easily. So for storage, I'll be able to take them apart and putting them back together when I want to use them. May never actually need to use them, but whatever, I have the option, right? The important thing is that I'll be able to store them flat, because this takes up a lot more room than that, right? So when I want to use them, I just want to make sure, you just have to make sure that you put them together in order. And so this L-shaped piece goes in first. And then you just kind of wiggle this thing into place, and there it is. It's the same thing with both of them. I was afraid that painting over the surfaces that join, so this surface right here, I was afraid that painting over that was going to make it so that these wouldn't fit together well again, and so I'd have to go back and remove the paint from those parts. Turns out I didn't have to worry about that. So this goes on pretty nicely. Same thing here, and they're fairly sturdy. These are fairly sturdy. There's another one of these in the Octarius box kit that is not as sturdy as these, so I may have to do something different with them. So the other thing that I want to point out is that I did not use these legs. So these terrain pieces have legs. You can put them in a couple of different places, but they're only tall enough to be glued on to this I-beam thing, right? So if you glue it to the I-beam, it reaches the floor. If you glue it anywhere else, it does not reach the floor. And gluing to this I-beam, there's a very small surface area where this would be joined up. I don't like that at all. And since my plan was to flat pack it, I would have to magnetize, and it's just, I decided, you know what, maybe this terrain piece doesn't need its leg. And I mean, honestly, it doesn't. It doesn't really buy you anything other than, it looks a little cooler maybe. But I'm thinking this would be an excellent bit to cut up and add to an interesting looking base. So maybe this will have a better life put to use elsewhere. What else did I learn from this project? I learned that I didn't have as much fun with this as I thought I was gonna. I thought because of all the detail and all the different textures, I thought it was going to be a really cool painting project, and it kind of is. But there was just so many choices to make along the way. What detail do you pick out? Do I paint this, or do I leave it the background color? How many colors should I use? Oh my gosh, the number of decisions was endless, and And it was just, it's a lot of model. There's a lot to this thing, and there's two sides to every piece. I feel like it takes me less time to paint up a Primaris tank than it took me to paint this. I may be exaggerating, I'm not entirely sure, but it certainly felt that way. There's just so much detail that you could pick out. And obviously, if you're trying to speed paint, you want to paint as few details as possible while still making your model look good. And my problem is that painting up more details didn't actually make the model look better. It kind of made the model look worse, which is not what you want, right? More effort should equal better result, but in this case, it feels like more effort led to worse results. So, I don't know. So, my suggestion is when you approach this, if you do something like this, is to be kind of stingy with your color palette. Be kind of stingy with the details that you pick out, and paint what is necessary. Paint what will draw the eye, like stuff like that icon. Maybe this feature right here. Definitely these little teeth. Everything else, meh. You could probably get away with not focusing on too much. Yeah, I mean, it was a cool project. It just took a lot of time, and it was more time than I was thinking, I guess, is my whole deal. One of the other things I learned, and this is actually something I'm going to take away from to other projects, is that base coating in black and then making it metallic with a silver dry brush, it has a really cool effect. In fact, I like it a lot better than painting it silver, or priming it silver and then adding black wash. I think the black one looks a lot more interesting and still metallic than the silver one. Maybe it's just the shadows are deeper, and so the highlights come out a little bit better. I don't know, but this still strikes me as metallic, but it doesn't strike me as monolithically metallic. Whereas this one, it's like a big chunk of silver. Even the patches of rust. Maybe if I had made the whole thing rusty, it would be a different thing. I don't know. Whatever the case, there are definite advantages to both, but I think the black prime with the silver dry brush is gonna take you further. I certainly would not recommend doing the black prime and then the silver base coat, because that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of paint, and it doesn't look as good as this. So, yeah, if you're curious about kind of a fast way of getting the first couple layers on, this is the way I would recommend for sure. Another thing I learned about this is if you go the silver route, you're going to need a lot of wash. And I mean a lot of wash. I probably used like half a bottle of wash on these. In fact, I used so much that I kind of ran out of the pre-mixed, the purchased stuff, so I had to mix my own, and I did not like the results of my own mix. I'm going to have to do some additional research on this, but at least the results of this experience suggest just don't run out of your washes. Always have a few extra. I know I have a few extra now, and I'm going to make sure that stays that way. Well, that's all I got for this project. I guess too long didn't read or didn't hear. Just keep it simple. Keep it simple, and you'll have a decent time. Just remember, this will take a lot more time than you think. So be wary. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this video is going to save you some time in the future, and you'll end up having some awesome looking Orky structures in your hobby collection. Have a wonderful afternoon. Be nice to yourselves and each other. Peace.